to the first session properly, I want to just say I'm just so excited. I think Corin says that Aura and I helped a lot, but really Corin just had such a visionary idea of bringing so many people from very different walks, different places, but also different kinds of research. If you've started to look at the Padlet, I don't know, maybe 18 people or something like that have done it so far, but it's just fabulous, the work that people are doing and where you're doing it from. And so I just want to say, I think it's fantastic that people are willing to dedicate this time, and the people who are giving lectures or engagements on this and the students, I think everybody is really excited about it, and that's great. Corin did mention, and I wonder if for you, you have sufficient data, I would super appreciate it if you leave your camera on, because even though we're 2 years into the pandemic, I still find it a strange experience to sit and look at my computer and talk a lot. I still feel like it's a sign of, I don't know, loneliness or something. So I know you are out there, and I understand that people do have data limitations, but if it's okay for you, it's great for me to see your wonderful faces and to know that you're out there. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about what I'm going to do with my session, and kind of start with an apology, really, because although much of the week is going to be spent in sort of smaller group work, I'm actually starting with much more of a traditional kind of overview of things. And I would like you to absolutely stop me along the way as I go, but really for the next, sorry, we are together for the next whatever, hour and 20 minutes. And I will try to leave a good deal of time at the end for direct discussion, but also as we go along, I hope you will stop me. I don't have a break planned in the middle. Basically, I'm going to break up the presentation part into two sections. And the first, let me just share my screen now with you. So hopefully you see that. And let me just put this up here. Yeah, so the first is really going to be an overview of a lot of the sort of the history of life story research, what we mean by it, where it sort of has come from. And then in the second part, I'm going to draw from different projects that I myself have done, and collecting people's stories, usually political stories. And together, hopefully we can try to make some sense of what they are saying and how we can apply this life story framework to trying to understand not only people's sense of their own lives, but actually what we might be able to read off in a larger sense about the context in which their lives are lived from these. So I start here with this particular picture. I could have started with really any picture. Anybody want to say what they see in this picture? Why I might have put it out there? What's going on here? Do you have any questions when you see this? I looked at so many pictures trying to think what might be an interesting one to start. And I don't know if any of you have any sense when you see this. I mean, I guess I'm sort of struck clearly by these two people talking. And it looked to me, I mean, again, this is a question of using your imagination. I have no idea what they're talking about or who they are. I know nothing about them. But what I wanted to make the sense was that is that we are telling stories all the time. And often when we are telling them in more intimate settings, as this seems it might be, we're telling stories about our lives to one another. And we actually take as a everyday activity that we somehow can understand what we're saying about our lives, and we understand what other people are saying. And I think here you can, you can say, well, this is Paris. This is, you can read things about the weather, about where they are, and you can imagine all sorts of things. Anyway, so I start with this to say, really, we're talking about an everyday activity, which is then made into a academic endeavor. So here I just use this. There's a cartoon, an American cartoon, which I once saw a particular one of it, and it's called Andy Cap, and there's always tension bickering really between the husband and wife. And at one point she's on the phone and she puts her hand over the receiver and she says, "This isn't gossip, it's oral history." Okay, and the reason I include that here is, I mean, it's sort of making a joke of it in a way, but that in fact, we tell stories, listen to stories of others all the time. And the thing about life story work is that we try to then understand them framed in an academic sense. But what I'm trying to say to us is that we pull from all sorts of things that we already know, that we already practice every day. Ken Plummer, whose work I'm going to be drawing on a lot today, says here that the life story is a source for understanding the workings of a life and the culture of which it is a part. And for me, what is critical as a social scientist who uses life stories in my research is to say that I'm not really just interested, or even primarily interested, in the particulars of the lives of the people who I speak with. That in fact, for me, what is the most interesting part of this kind of work is that it is a prism through which we can try to understand larger social political processes. So there's this dynamic between the micro and macro narratives. And I think probably one of the reasons Corinne asked me to kick off this session is really to highlight, I mean, a lot of us do use personal narratives, or what here I'm framing as life stories. A lot of us do use them in our work, but I think that when we do that, we're always interested in the larger context in which these lives are lived. And when we come to look at the work that, the extracts from the projects that I do, I think you'll see this more, and we will talk about this more. Thank you. As I say, we're going to come and we're going to talk about Ken Plummer's work more in a moment. And by the way, if you want to stop me at any point, please do, or if you have any comments to make, I appreciate that. So just a second here. So Ken Plummer has written a lot about life histories and as being a humanistic method. He says, life story research involves getting close to living human beings accurately, yet imaginatively picking up the way they express their understandings of the world about them, perhaps providing an analysis of such expressions, presenting them in interesting ways, and being critically aware of the immense difficulties such tasks bring. So here, really, I want to say that while it is an everyday activity, the more you think about it, the more complicated it is. And what I particularly like about this quote here is that he says, well, we're trying to get close to these stories, but at the same time, it is always a leap of our own imagination. We as researchers are doing the best we can to understand worlds which are often very, very far from the worlds which we ourselves occupy. So it's an imaginative leap. And it's almost always an imperfect match, the attempt to try to understand other people and their lives. And this is why he says, yeah, it comes with immense difficulties. And I think it's important to be realistic about that. So when we start to think about stories, many, many, many questions emerge when we think about personal stories and the stories that people do and don't tell about their lives. For those of you who have been doing research with people and asking them to talk about their lives, you know very well that people select stories according to what they think is both most appropriate, most relevant for your purposes, but also according to the levels of their own comfort, what they are wishing to expose, what they think that you as the listener will be able to understand. So there's always this question of inclusion and exclusion of stories. Which ones are brought to the fore? Which ones are absolutely left behind in the dark? And when people tell particular stories, why do they start and end in the way they do? Kathy Reisman has argued for the strategic function of stories. People choose the stories that they are telling because they want them to do particular things. And so when we're trying to make sense of them, the question is, well, what is this person trying to do with this story? And this, of course, maps onto stories never, ever are, sitting on their own in isolation. They always have relations to other stories. And how do we actually connect the stories which we are hearing to other stories which we know? And anyway, so that I'm not going to go through each of these questions, but we will perhaps look at some of them when we're looking at the actual extracts. Plummer goes on to sort of flesh out what he calls a sociology of stories. And again, these PowerPoints are going to be available for you later. And if any of you want, I should have mentioned earlier that I am running the drop-in session for tomorrow morning. So if you want to talk about any of these examples that I'm giving you here in more detail, or you want to bring your own data and let's see, how it works in relation to some of the things I'm talking about here, I'm actually regarding that drop-in session tomorrow as kind of like an extension place for us to play with some of the stuff if you want to do that. But I want to indicate here that there is this quite rigorous academic framing which Plummer and other people have provided. But I have been using Ken Plummer so far a lot, but it's important to say that, in fact, this work has a long history. Not only, well, I'm trying to make sure that I can still see you while I'm seeing my slides here. And I'm only going to take it back 100 years, okay? But in fact, we could start hundreds of years ago. But as an academic discipline, I think a lot of people, where and when did personal stories start to become taken seriously as data, if you want to use that term? And a lot of people start that particular story in Chicago in the interwar period. Chicago, which is a big city in the American Midwest, which had experienced severe depression, and the Chicago School of Sociology, as it has been known, actually had several phases, but I'm talking about really the first phase of this. Now, one of the things that's interesting when you think about the Chicago School is that a lot of people who were not in this first phase, Ken Plummer himself actually wrote he published 4 volumes on a critical assessment of the Chicago School. And obviously he is very much alive and writing these days. And you're going to see there's a sort of an intergenerational communication of knowledge. So I'm not trying to put these people as standalone, but I am going to show you a little bit of that work because it's interesting as a way of trying to understand intellectual foundation. So the Chicago School had a number of people whose names later became very famous. Probably the first work, which is often cited as really being dedicated to life history work, was that of Thomas and Zanecki. And they did this study of Polish peasants in Europe and the States. And there they showed themselves to be sort of quite unusually open to methodological plurality. And here is an excerpt from what they say, which now seems almost quite radical. They say, in analyzing the experiences and attitudes of an individual, we always reach data and elementary facts, which are exclusively limited to this individual's personality, but can be treated as mere incidences of more or less general classes of data or facts, sorry for the typo there, and can thus be used for the determination of laws of social becoming. Now, this is interesting. So they say, yeah, sure, every individual is an individual, but we can actually use individual lives as a way of trying to understand wider phenomena. And then they go on to say a stronger version of that. If we are forced to use mass phenomena as material or any kind of happenings taken without regard to the life histories of individuals who participated, it's a defect, not an advantage of our present sociological method. In other words, far from being a drawback, studying individual lives must be a part of responsible social research. If it is not, they say, it's a defect. That's actually really interesting if you think about, I mean, they are writing more than 100 years ago, and we still have these debates about qualitative and quantitative data. And just to be anecdotal here, years ago when I was doing my PhD, and I had to do my registration paper, and I knew I wanted to do a intensively qualitative project on lifetime political activists. And the feedback I got at that time was from a woman who was, in a sense, politically sympathetic with the project. But she turned to me and she said, it's very interesting that that you were initially attracted to this project because you like people's stories, but now you're going to have to put that to the side and do some real scientific research. And it was incredible to me. She said that I should do, questionnaire surveys of 500 people at least who were lifetime activists. And I just said, I didn't know the academic arguments, but I knew that what she was describing to me had nothing to do with what I wanted to do. And I nearly packed up my PhD at that point. Anyway, another example of someone who was from the Chicago School was Clifford Shaw. Clifford Shaw published this life history of a mugger, as he called him, Jack the Roller, a delinquent boy's own story. And years later, that book would be republished with a foreword by Howard Becker. And Howard Becker, some 50 years later, took a lot of interest, not only in the Chicago School more generally. So Becker himself was based in at the University of Chicago in their sociology department, but this is half a century later. And he says here, he says, by providing this kind of voice from a culture and situation that are ordinarily not known to intellectuals generally and to sociologists in particular, the Jack roller enables us to improve our theories at the most profound level by putting ourselves in Stanley's skin. We can feel and become aware of the deep biases about such people that ordinarily permeate our thinking and shape the kinds of problems we investigate. By truly entering into Stanley's life, we can begin to see what we take for granted and ought not to in designing our research. What kinds of assumptions about delinquents, slums, and poles are embedded in the way we set the questions we study. So again, you can see here that he is saying it's not only that it's permissible, it's that this is actually the way that subjectivity, our understanding of the details of the lives of the people whose wider social political experience we want to understand, that actually the best way to do it is to get close to them. And here again, yet another person from the Chicago School, Ernest Burgess, says, in life history is revealed as in no other way the inner life of the person, his moral struggles, his successes and failures in securing his destiny in a world too often at variance with his hopes and ideals. And I think here, again, the idea of being close to the skin, as it were, of the people who one is doing research with is seen as being really, really important, both in terms of understanding their life, but also in trying to get a sense of the political struggles, the wider things which are challenging for them. Are there any questions or comments so far? I'm sorry, I have set this up so I do a lot of the talking, but if there's any comments, or let me see what's in the chat here. I hear your thoughts about stories that the Academy might not deserve. Interesting, yeah. Okay, well, I will proceed here. Corin, if you do see in the chat anything that you think I should be paying attention to, can you just let me know, because I can't see it when I actually have my slide in front of me.
Sure, I put my hand up earlier because there are some comments on that initial photograph, Molly, which are quite nice.
Should I go back? I can't see your hand even because the whole thing is my screen. So just interrupt me. Should we go back? Let's go back there.
So take a look at the chat for that. And then also Ismail has just asked a question around the relation to ethnography.
Okay, it's a little hard too. That's what. So what was the question about the, I wonder how they know each other. Is that from Sarah? Is that about this? A couple forming a friend. Yeah, this is really interesting. I have actually spent time sort of in a guessing thing with people. It's hard to read off this picture. I mean, I can't tell you anything about this picture really, but yeah, Sarah's, I wonder how they know each other. Why are they meeting here? Looking at how they are sitting with each other is sort of, you know, and this is interesting. I'm sorry, I missed all of this because it was the nature around absolutely the foreground and background in conversations, all the people that are around them. I mean, there is, I don't know if it's just me, but there's also, there's some people have raised about this picture, you know, there's some sense of like a clandestine meeting or something, like why are they there? And they are sitting in a particularly interesting way there. Sarah, any references for narrative inquiry, symbolic interactionism? I'm in one of the later slides. Oh no, actually the one I already did. There's a link to Ken Plummer's website of his work, and he has apps. It's a wonderful example of a very, very vibrant website, and he has a lot of stuff, Sarah, that I think you would really enjoy. There's symbolic interactionism, but also just lots of relevant readings, as well as discussions about stuff. It's not just a listing here. Oh, and I don't know, Oscar, what is William White's research on the culture of the corners? I don't know that. I don't know that. Is this similar to, I'd be grateful to hear you. Haley, nice mess. Oh, the stories that the Academy might not deserve. I think this is a really interesting, Haley's question, you know, are there stories that maybe the Academy doesn't deserve? And I think one of the things we're going to get to is, how do people actually choose which stories to tell you? Like, why are they, and maybe on the flip side of it, and Haley, maybe that relates to what you're saying as well, is are there questions which people think, well, maybe that might be relevant for what they are interested in researching, but actually I'm not giving that up here. I'm not, I don't actually have any particular reason to trust you with this, and I'm not going to feed that out here. And so I don't know if that's about deserving stories, but actually this whole question of what happens when people trust us with their stories. And in a sense, trust is a double-edged sword in a way, because at one level you can say, well, it's great, you've built this trust, and then people tell you all this stuff. But actually, it's a very deep and complicated responsibility, because at the end of the day, you're not necessarily committed to being true to their story as they see it. And maybe they have given you their trust, and they might elaborate on things that they would otherwise be more withholding on. But in fact, you're going to step back and use that as material which you are going to analyze and have it as part of your larger project. So I sometimes feel like it's complicated when people trust you, because you have to be worthy of it. Okay. So Haley says, my questions related to the trust we're afforded by the people we enter into these research encounters and the manner that the Academy, yes, Haley, that's exactly what I'm referring to here. Not only the manner that the Academy will later use that knowledge, that's true, but also even with the best of intentions, once you publish something, you don't really have a lot to say about what happens to the life of the story after it's out there. And there can be very unintentional consequences. Not only the use that the Academy puts, but in fact, the very use that is made of the research that we do once it is made public. My good friend and colleague, Richard Sparks, did a lot of work in prisons, continues to do a lot of work in prisons, high security prisons. And I can get this, I will get this reference for you shortly, but in any case, he did an intensive research project with prisoners in Barlinnie prison in Scotland, and prisoners who he spoke with, he developed relationships with them over time, and he published this work. And ultimately, he thought it was intended as expressing the points of view of the prisoners and fighting for their rights. But in fact, it was used against them and used as an excuse to close down the prison, which was exactly what none of the prisoners wanted that. And so that was really, really problematic. He's actually written about that because he just thought, how could have I possibly written that and not had those other glasses on, seeing how this research might be misused. Okay, so this is great. Okay, so I'm gonna carry on here, but please keep me informed of this chat, because it's just hard to have all these. My laptop is not so big, so I can only have a few images at the same time. So we have Howard Becker there, yeah. And then, so that's a good, 100 years ago that the Chicago School is happening. But this is actually a theme which keeps coming and going. So it's taken up again in 1959 by C. Wright Mills in a book that is still very, very often quoted, called The Sociological Imagination. And Mills writes here, "We have come to see that the biographies of men and women, the kinds of individuals they variously become, cannot be understood without reference to the historical structures in which the milieu of their everyday lives are organized." And he goes on to say that actually scholars should always be interested in trying to make the connections between biographies and history, and that one informs the other. And it's not just that by looking at biographies, you get a better sense of history, but by looking at history, you get a much better sense of the lives that people are living. And in the United Kingdom, which is where I am, some of this work also was happening. So, across the ocean, as it were, from the Chicago School, but the mass observation archives, which are still going to this day, which are run at the university, which are kept at the University of Sussex now. Back in 1937, when the king abdicated the throne because he wanted to marry a Philadelphia divorcee, and he couldn't do so as a king, so he abdicated the throne. And a couple of dropouts from Cambridge University said, this is a really, really interesting thing that has happened here. And that although we are hearing about it only from, in a sense, the top down, in fact, if you go into pubs, you realize that people are talking about this all the time. And here in the United Kingdom, that's still kind of the case, right? I mean, if you go out, I mean, people do talk about Prince Andrew and what he had, or we no longer call him Prince, and what he gets up to. And yet it's a quite different understanding than the way that that story is publicly fed to us. Anyway, so these two guys, this Tom Harrison and Charles Madge, decided that they were going to go up north to Bolton and to do a and to do a study there. They were going to actually hang around in pubs and listen to what were people actually talking about, not how are the papers reporting this, but actually, what do people talk about when they hang out and have a pint or 2 pints or whatever? And they published a wonderful book, which was called The Pub and the People. And here the idea was very much that we should be taking seriously what happens in people's everyday conversations about their lives. Okay, wait, I see that Sarah has something here on symbolic interactionism and narrative. Norman Denzin has written a lot about the two. Yes, that's right. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Corin, sorry. I thought that was from Sarah. Yes, this is all true. Okay. So, mass observation archives actually, started in this context. And they really, what was radical about it similarly to Chicago, was that they were taking seriously the everyday lives of people and how they told stories about those lives. Okay. And that continues to this day. Mass observation now is primarily based, people use it as an archive. So there's diaryists and people write regularly on assigned topics or whatever. But this was quite a sort of radical idea that this could be a way to study historical political change. And Tom Harrison and Charles Madge, they described what they wanted mass observation to be was, quote, an anthropology of ourselves. So again, this idea, rather than going out and trying to look at other people's lives, that actually we include ourselves in this as well. Oh yeah, here's where I put Ken Plummer's link, just because it's really worth exploring. But again, coming into more recent times, Ken Plummer, well, he first publishes, not so recent, he first publishes the Documents of Life. The first volume of that was in 1983, but he then, about 20 years later, did a second volume of this. And he says life story research involves, oh no, I already told you that, so sorry. Did I getting close to living? No, getting close to living human beings. Yes, and accurately and imaginatively picking up on that. So we have seen that, but that is in the 1980s when he picks this up really as an academic tool, and actually uses it very much himself in his groundbreaking work called Telling Sexual Stories, which he published, I don't know, the early 1990s. So this is a trend of taking life story research, increasingly seriously in the academy, despite its rocky history in a sense, over the past 30 years. And if you did have a chance to read Barbara Harrison's chapter, which I made available, she fleshes out some of this history. But I think that you can see it in a number of different threads. You can see it in the oral history movement, a lot of feminist scholarship, anti-colonialist struggles. A lot of research which is trying to connect people's lived experiences with wider social structures, really has taken life histories, life stories very seriously. And so we need to actually connect this micro and macro. So let me see how I am doing for time here. Oh, good, we have lots of time. So in my own work, I've tended to concentrate on life stories of people who are living through times of political rupture. And I describe the work I do broadly as being that of political narratives. And here is an example of Eric Selbin's wonderful Revolution, Rebellion, and Resistance, The Power of Story. He gives an overview, I think, of this kind of work. And he says here, people rely on stories to make sense of their world, their place in it, their impossibilities. Stories reflect and refract people's lives in a way that almost no other text can, making the abstract concrete, the complex more manageable, and rendering matters, quote, real. Stories reduce the immense complexity of the world involving our daily lives to human-sized matters, adding information to stores that are already stocked, fitting by and large into familiar pathways. So again, just saying stories are basically never simple. There's all these different levels of them, and it's quite hard work actually to use them as a way to make sense. I'm not going to, this is really just an overview of what we're going to do in a moment, trying to understand, trying to think about how we break down particular stories, which we hear, which we come across. And we might return to this slide. I sort of have it out there as a way of sort of foregrounding some of the discussion which we might have when we look at the actual passages. And we can return to it or not as you like. Because what I want to do now is to show you some extracts from my own research and to see if together we can try to make sense of what is being said in these various research contexts. So the first one that I'm going to tell you about is, well, I can leave it there, actually, is an extract of an interview with a woman called Rose Kerrigan. This was part of a project I did for my PhD. I mentioned it before. Real life out there, yes. My PhD was a study of lifetime socialist activists here in the UK. And I was trying to understand how people who had been politically active on the left, fighting for social justice for 50 years or longer, how had they sustained their commitment to working for progressive political change. And this is an interview I had with a woman called Rose Kerrigan. At the time of our interview, she was, I'm going to say, about 91. Rose was an incredible character, and she was also the wife of Peter Kerrigan, who was the first secretary of the Communist Party of Great Britain, which was very, very active in the interwar times. Anyway, so I'm asking Rose about her early life, and she tells me here, she says, so she was from Glasgow, and she's telling me about growing up in Glasgow. And she says, I remember as early as being 7 or 8 years and thinking that it was very odd that there were so many people who could afford to be dressed up. You see, we lived around the corner from the Royal Theatre in Glasgow. They used to wear offsprays in their hair with this band round there and long flowing robes. And we used to go down and watch them go into the theater from taxis and wonder, here we could hardly buy our own shoes. That made me feel that there was something wrong somewhere. Why did these people not share their money with us? I never felt anger and I never felt envy. I just felt it was wrong somehow. And then she goes on to say, at 12 years old, I took part in the 1915 rent strike in Glasgow. When Rose tried to convince her mother to withhold the extra rent, the mother said, we'll run into debt. We'll never be able to get out of it. And I said to her, you give the extra money to me and I'll bank it. Can you imagine, 12 years old? Then when I saw I couldn't convince her by myself, I went up the whole close, which was 16 tenants, and got them all agreed to withhold the rent. And we never ever paid that increase. When the rent man came for the rent, we paid the rent, but we never paid the increase. The result was the 1915 Rent Restriction Act, which lasted until 1957. There weren't increased rents. So, and here you have a picture of the Glasgow rent strike of 1915. Any reactions to that story? Why does she tell me that story about growing up next to the Theatre Royal in Glasgow? Division, absolutely, Sarah, division, yeah. I mean, what's interesting to me is, you know, I ask her, she's in her 90s, okay? She's talking about more than 80 years ago, okay? And how does she say, and I say, you know, where did your political commitment come from? And she says here, you know, it just seemed really odd that there were all these people who could be so dressed up. We could barely afford our shoes, and there they were. It was wrong. And you can see her making a linkage between that and not being able to pay the rent, but actually realizing that there needed to be a collective response to this. It highlights the rich versus the poor, absolutely. And as she says, I didn't feel anger. I just thought it was so wrong. Okay, so you see this intense sense of injustice. Now, it's amazing that she observes the rich and realizes there's a problem and expresses it in the simplest way. Richa, absolutely. And a great relation with her life experience in the socio-political context. Yeah, so for me, what's really interesting is people say to me, well, okay, it's great for you to collect these stories, but you know, how do you know if they're true or not? Well, very often when I'm interviewing people, I don't know if what they are saying is true. And, you know, I don't know, I have no way of knowing that Rose actually lived in the house next door to the Theatre Royal. Let me see what Tamara is saying. Speaks to me of an important and precocious awareness of their own identity. Absolutely, of the construction of a we, and therefore, reminds me of the spatial experiences. You guys are, you can, I love your comments. You can also say them, by the way, so I don't have to read them. It reminds me of the spatial experiences of inequality. These are beautiful comments, guys. Yeah, and I'm actually taken by this story because it's not only, one of the things which is interesting is it's one of the few stories that I heard that at least I know absolutely that the Glasgow rent strike of 1915 really was a thing, okay? And she says here that she was 12, okay? And I did already know that she was born in 1903. So, I mean, all of that stacks up. But what is interesting for me is that she is actually providing this as an explanatory framework, which actually helps you to make connections across her whole life of why she did what she did. So I think that we can actually see this as a larger story, as it were. Okay, let me, I can go on. Yeah, because I want to leave us. Sometimes as a journalist, I was trapped in the views of the experts while avoiding the facts that common people also have their own realities. These are great comments, guys. Okay, so I can push us on to another story. This is Rose making this explicit connection, okay? But let's look at something else, same study. This is an interview with a woman called Eileen Daffern. And I asked Eileen. Eileen was one of the only people who really identified herself as a feminist, which was a kind of unusual term given her age. Okay, she was born, I think, about 1913, and that is a term that a lot of people want to use, but she used it all the time. And she talks about her experience of growing up in a working class family in the north of England. And she says here about her mother, she says, my mother was very tyrannical. And I'm sure it was because of those frustrations that she had. She was very tyrannical with me. Now, from a narrative point of view, I mean, the word tyrannical is a very, very strong word. To use it twice in one sentence is really very strong. Now, okay, her mother, she had already told me that her mother was a twin. And she says, now the other twin was not bright. My mother was intellectually much stronger. And I think she never got over that. She had a much better intellect, much more searching, and she asked the questions. Molly, the not so smart sister, became a teacher, and mother after that really lived vicariously, because what had happened, and I'm going to show you more of that quote, is that the father actually chose the sister who he thought was smarter to stay home with him and to help manage the home, and sent the other one off to school to further her education. So here she then says, because again, the thing about my radicalism, if you like, my aunt brought up home to Yorkshire every holiday her friends from teaching. They were all unmarried because the men had been killed in the war. And they were very wonderful teachers from London with red hair, beautiful beads and clothes. They sang, they were talented. And my mother took their breakfast trays up in the morning, and that must have been quite bitter. But they became her friends, and she sewed clothes for them, and I can just think what must have gone on underneath it all. What do you hear in this story? Any reactions there? I was really interested that she uses this story to show the roots of her radicalism by showing the women who she was, who she met, but who her own mother had to look after. And she herself was regularly beat by her mother. She talks about it more in other places. It's very, very abusive. But she reads it as her mother being just a very, very frustrated woman. And one of the things that Eileen did in her political work was absolutely dedicated herself to women's education. It's an interesting story because unlike the earlier socialist participant, the roots of her feminism stem from class envy. She chose to show that she understood her mother, even though she said her mother was tyrannical. Her mother was tyrannical in the complexity of emotions and what that leads to. Absolutely. Her mother was tyrannical with her personally, in that, I mean, she actually would beat her regularly. She really, as opposed to how Eileen also had a brother, so maybe I should have fleshed out a bit of that quote a bit more. But I think that for me, one of the things that's really interesting is she doesn't blame her mother here. She simply sees those roots as, sees those experiences as a motivator for herself to become educated. And how she frames this, okay? And the historical framing with the women who become teachers, etc. If there's time, or even in the session tomorrow, the drop-in session, I would love to, there's a lot of backstory in that particular part of that interview, because I once presented it in front of Eileen in a professional setting. And I mean, I asked her in advance if it was okay to use the story, and she approved it, but that led to us having a very long conversation about what it means to use your personal experience and to see your personal experience up there represented as something for academics to understand. Okay, I'm going to go to my last story, and then we will and then we'll have just time for discussion. I'm loving your comments, though. They're really fantastic. Okay, this last story relates to a project that I've been doing for almost 3 decades, bizarrely. And some of you might have heard me talk about this excerpt before. The project that I've been doing since 1992 has been with former dissidents of East Germany, people who had been anti-state activists, and for 28 years, I've been returning to them, asking them about their understandings of their own actions and I am working on a manuscript which is called something like Remembering Revolution, what happens over decades as people try to make sense of the political changes that they've been involved with. So the interview that I'm going to show you, it's a long extract. It's with somebody called Reinhard Weissun, and he was a leader of, he was one of the founding members of a group called the Initiative for Peace and Human Rights, a leading East German activist. And I asked him, like I asked many people, what did you do on the night of November the 9th, 1989, which is the night that the Berlin Wall opened up? And this is a long excerpt, okay? So I warn you here, but we're gonna use it as a way to flesh out other stuff. So, okay, Sarah, I'm gonna read your stuff in just a moment here. Okay, so I say, what did you do on the night of November the 9th, 1989? And he says, on the way home at about 10:30 p.m., I noticed many people all running in the same direction. They were all running to the end of the world. The street was full of cars. One could hardly walk at all. I then walked with the stream and got to the border crossing, Bornholmerstrasse, which was the first crossing to be opened, 200 meters from here. It was so crammed with people you couldn't move, and everybody was pushing through the crossing. The policemen were just standing around. They didn't know what to do. They were completely puzzled. I have to say, East German police were not at all known for just standing around. And this was just a few months after Tiananmen Square. The person who was then the head of the East German state had actually gone to Tiananmen Square to actually compliment the Chinese on their successful controlling of the protests. So the worry, of course, was that there would be a Tiananmen solution to East Germany's problems. So this was the state there. Anyway, the policemen were just standing around. They didn't know what to do. They were completely puzzled. I asked a few people what was happening. Of course, I could see, I know, but I didn't I didn't understand. I stood there for about half an hour in this crowd and then went home and switched the television on. Now, what you should have to know to understand this is that while East Germans were not allowed to cross the border, in fact, they all had televisions, or most people had televisions, and they could get West German reception in their homes, okay? So he says here, Reinhard Weissun says, then I watched everything on television, transmissions from everywhere, the Kudamm, all other border crossings from West Berlin, i.e. on the other side of the wall. And I could see that people were coming over. That is as seen from the West. So it's really interesting, just to flesh this out a bit here, is the reality on the street, literally outside his house, is too much for him to take in. So he can't get any explanation, and he has no, it's very hard to understand. And so he goes and he turns on the television, and there he has this West German reception, and all these people are flooding, quote, in, as I could see these people were coming over as seen from the West. So it's a really displaced movement here. And he says, I was totally paralyzed. All this continued for the next few days, and it took me a whole week before I went across the Potsdamer Straße. It's difficult to describe. This was such a very elementary transformation of one's existence, of the whole world in a way. I'll try to explain. I've been in Berlin since 73. I've always lived 200 meters from the wall. And this wall to me has become a symbol of captivity in every respect, also in a metaphoric, symbolic sense. And this is what I have been ramming my head against for the last 20 years. And I had, as a way of survival, I had resolved to ignore this wall as far as I could. And I tried to do the same throughout the week when the wall had gone. I did not only try to suppress the fact that the wall had been there previously, but I also tried to suppress the fact that it had gone, and it didn't work. This is the last bit of it then. When I went across the wall for the first time, I did so at Potsdamer Platz, where there hadn't been a crossing. They had only torn a hole, simply torn a hole into the wall, yes. And that's where I wanted to go through, precisely there. I walked through like a sleepwalker. I could not conceive of the idea up to the moment when I was through that was possible. Well, and then I stood for a very long time over at the other side in no man's land and could not move forward or backwards. And then I cried. I was totally overwhelmed. And so, okay, let me just see what you guys are writing here. So Sarah, I was wondering, are these the actual stories or have they been edited in their details to disguise the identity? No, all of these people, I'm assuming perhaps that the participants are well-known activists. I was wondering about anonymity, particularly in light of the depth of intimacy in the stories related. Sarah, such a great question. Gosh, I would love, okay, I'll just mention it briefly now, and then hopefully we can return to that more. People felt very strongly about being identified, far from, in fact, they criticized it as a very Western construct, the idea that we would somehow think that they wanted their stories of their lives to be associated with their name, and actually found it a very strange process. I almost, the whole idea of filling out ethics forms and the possibility of anonymizing them was simply something that didn't speak to them at all. That's for the East German group. For the other two, in my PhD, I definitely had to make them anonymous, but I then, after my PhD, I wrote a book, which was called Lifetimes of Commitment. So I went back to them and I said, look, for my PhD, you were anonymous. And in fact, I had asked them to choose their own names for that. And I said, but for the book, you can choose your own, you can choose any name, you can, including your own. 14 of the 15 chose to use their own name. And when the one who had chosen not to use her own name heard that, she said, oh, this is ridiculous. Of course I want to use my own name. I just thought, okay. And she said, I'm not going to be the only person not using my name. So I think, I mean, I have actually written on that before, how there's a really strong assumption that people want to be anonymous, and that somehow, you know, that their stories are so intimate that they're not things that they themselves think can be used as teaching, as stories of experience associated with themselves. So but I have to say that there are problems with that as well. Like I once was trying to publish a piece on that in a particular journal, and it was literally as it was going to press, and one of the senior editors of the journal realized that the names were their real names and would not proceed with the publication unless I changed the names. And I said, but they don't want those names changed. And I almost pulled it, but I didn't. because it was so far down the road. I mean, and I just thought this is a different story itself, which is what we assume people must want to happen to the stories of their lives. Okay, but let's just return to this. Oh, well, Rebecca says here, the TV element of the story is so interesting. 9/11, people could see what happened on the Twin Towers, but collectively watch TV in order to understand it. Yeah. Okay? Well, let's look at just a quick. If I was trying to analyze this piece with Reinhard Weisshund, for me, there are so using that framework, which I showed earlier, this thing about who is telling the story. First of all, who he is, one of the sort of rare, long-standing activists. But clearly, this story actually makes sense very much as the story it is not. It is not a story about popping open bottles of champagne at the Brandenburg Gate. So he is not this sort of, he knows that I know this other Berlin Wall opening story. And it's very much and it makes sense very much as highlighted in contradistinction to this other kind of story. And there's the many sort of who's in this story, not only him, but the police, and his depiction of the police is just incredible. It's such a contrast to what was generally known and thought about the East German police. And of course, those masses of people who were in fact pushing to get through. So in terms of who, but also why does he tell this particular story? I said earlier that Kathy Reisman says we really need to ask ourselves a question of, what is it that the narrative does? Well, this is for me a very sort of, it's part of a sort of genre, fall of the wall story. It's a not the fall of the wall story. If you will, it's a sort of counter narrative, which actually makes us question our assumptions about, not only about November the 9th, 1989, but indeed that narrative which reverberates down the decades, and we still have it every few years. We've just had 2 years ago, the 30th anniversary. And again, the Western press is just full of these celebratory stories, but that's not really, that doesn't capture the complexity of many people's experiences. This here, what is he telling? What is left unsaid? I think that if we had more time, a close reading of this long extract actually shows quite a lot of psychological shifting and challenges. There's a series of responses. In a sense, there's a whole process by which he came to be able to cross the wall. But interestingly, he doesn't have to say, I say here, what's left unsaid. What is left unsaid is as important, perhaps more important than what he says, which is that this is a critical moment in his life, and it is a critical moment in history. Okay, and that is the way. You cannot understand his paralysis, his near ability to be unable to move backwards or forwards without actually seeing the context, the geographic context, but the socio-political context in which that happens, okay? And if you want to understand East Germany now, I think that's not a bad metaphor either. This neither here nor there, okay? Where is the story located? This is super interesting as well, because Bornholmerstrasse is actually where he lives, all right? And that is the first place that the Berlin Wall opened. So, and he's very clear with the explicit placing of the narrative, okay? So it's not Potsdamer Platz where, in fact, people broke through with, as you see here, the pickaxe. And why that was important for him in terms of being able to find his own way, this making a hole through the wall. The questions of time were really, really interesting because he's so explicit of 10:30. Geez, sorry about that. 10:30 at night on November the 9th. There's the time of the recounting. And then there's the, I want to say the present time, which is now 10 years ago, because 20 years on, one of the things I've done over these decades has been to return to people with their own stories. And so I ask him 20 years later, I say, on November the 9th, 2009, did you have any special feelings? At that point, did you do anything special to mark the day? And he says here, well, every day on my way to work, I pass the border twice. I pass to the west, I pass back to the east. There at Bollenharmstrasse, that means thousands of times I pass back and forth in my everyday life. That means I don't think of it every day, but from time to time. And of course, in other situations. And still today, I can break into tears when I hear this story and see these pictures. It is absolutely elemental then and still now. And I say to him, did you feel distant or connected to all the public acknowledgement of this 20th anniversary? And he says, 2 years ago, when the 20th anniversary of the wall was celebrated, there was a huge event organized by the state at the Brandenburg Gate, to which I was invited. It was really embarrassing, a big event, thousands and thousands of people in a show. But it doesn't, I didn't like it because it was too much show, superficial. But it doesn't move me either. And here I say, but it doesn't break you either. Because both he and I have just read and listened to again the transcripts of the interview in which he tells this story about being paralyzed. And he says to me, no, it doesn't touch me, okay? And what is interesting, and I don't have a slide to represent this, but then a year and a half ago on the 30th anniversary, I again spent that with Reinhard Weishuhn. And we again revisit this story. And so I use this as a sort of elaborate example of trying to show you my attempt at making sense of this person's life over time, but connecting it to this wider political historical phenomenon. And I just want to finish here with this powerful quote by Hannah Arendt. She writes here, compared with the reality which comes from being seen and heard, even the greatest forces of intimate life, the passions of the heart, the thoughts of the mind, the delights of the senses, lead to an uncertain, shadowy kind of existence, unless and until they are transformed, deprivatized, de-individualized, as it were, into a shape to fit them for public appearance. The most current of such transformations occurs in storytelling. And I think she does, she really addresses here the importance of the de-individualized process, even of intimate stories, and addressing the question that was raised earlier, don't people want these anonymous stories, these intimate stories to be anonymized? I think we can look to Arendt's comment here for an answer. She's saying, no, even the most intimate of these stories should be put into stories, transformed, de-individualized. And that when we look at that, there is this connection between the different levels of narrative, the micro and the macro. Okay, so let me see here from Micha. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so possibly I can actually see you. Stop share. Okay, nice. Now I can see more of you. That's great. Our interviews, the main method to life stories. No, I mean, well, I shouldn't say no, as the main, they are a means for doing life stories, and all the examples, it has to be said, that I've been using here are interview based, but people use many different kinds of materials, and I should have said that when trying to understand life stories. I mean, Corin has done some really brilliant work, body maps, and people, Anne Phoenix is with us here, and she's done gorgeous work where she gives cameras to people and they walk around and take pictures of places which are part of their everyday lives, or in fact, they give them to family members. There's more traditional ways which you can use archives or letters and diaries. There's all sorts of materials. Some of the work Susan Bell has done talks about biographical objects, you know, what kind, asking people to talk about an object which is close to them. There are many things which, many different kinds of materials that we can bring into the circle as we try to make sense of the life someone is living. And I think that's a really important question there. What about in-depth interviews for life story, our interviews? So, I mean, I have to say in my own work, I have tended to use in-depth interviews, but I also have, because I ended up knowing these people for such a long time, I also have like letters from them, and I've spent many hours in archives. And also, for instance, with my East German participants, you know, a lot of the work that they are telling me about their anti-state activism happened when they were when their lives were being scrutinized by the Stasi, by the secret police. And I've looked with them at the archives of photography that were pictures that taken by the Stasi of them, which were just really very haunting images, because you have the way you can tell a Stasi photograph is that it is sort of framed by a dark circle, because they had these long lenses, and they're very innocuous photographs in a sense, but really haunting. They'd be like of people standing out on the street having a fag, you know, and you see that there they are being photographed by the Stasi. And so that kind of thing of taking, going with them, and them helping to select photographs which they want me to use as I try to represent their lives. So it's not really a picture of them, it's them as seen through the lens of the Stasi. Political memoirs. What do I think of opting political memoirs as a primary source for life stories or personal narratives? There are different takes on that. I think that I have interviewed some people who have actually published memoirs about their lives, and it's definitely important that you have read them. You should be familiar what they've said publicly about their lives, but I think that that's a particular kind of object, if you will. If we went back to the earlier, that slide when I was saying, here are the questions we could ask, like who is the audience, who's it written for, but you might, in my experience, I have found quite different kinds of stories come up in interviews than because they are co-created. Aura in 2 days is going to talk to you a lot about you know, co-creating narratives. And clearly my presence in the interviews is really important in terms of what comes out. Gosh, I realize the time but we're gonna have, by the way, there's such great comments here, and I am glad that I get this breakout session tomorrow so we can have time with it. I'm sorry. What advice would you have for a novice like me looking at my interviews I did for my master's now through a narrative lens? I'm not sure where to start or if I'm doing it right. Well, Sarah, okay, so I would say to all of you, but Sarah, definitely, if you have a chance, like come tomorrow, we can look at stuff. I mean, one of the things people say to me, you know, do people really talk like that in your interviews? I mean, you know, they're really, you know, they're really articulate. They're really, and I would say, yes, they do. I mean, I didn't write that material myself. But on the other hand, I have selected these, and a narrative analysis is always has to start and end with really who is selecting, who is selecting the extracts. Why are you starting here and ending here? And you know, what is this question that is being asked? You have to bring yourself into the analysis, is what I'm saying. But Sarah, when you're choosing, you also have to say, well, what is it that I want this thing to do? Let's see what Alejandro has written here. There was a debate in our university in Bolivia about the belonging of psychology within the narrative approach. Some tell us it's a sociological, anthropological research. What can you tell us about the search for constructs, concepts typical of positivist psychology within narrative research? Oh, Alejandra, okay, it's a great question. We are actually at 3:30. I'm going to say that what I am, but fortunately we have Corinne Squire and Anne Phoenix and Jill Bradbury, Casey, who's just about to follow, everybody, all of them are psychologists. So we are going to be returning to this as well. But what I would say is that people like the ones who you're being taught by this week or tend to be very, very multidisciplinary people. And even though, yes, if I'm pushed against a wall and I have to say what discipline I'm part of, I would say I'm a psychologist. I am. That's how I was trained. But for me, life is much, much more interesting getting out of that box than staying in it. And I think that to me, it is not really such a question if it belongs in psychology or not. I think that we have examples of great narrative psychologists right here. But I also think some people like Ruth Ellen Josselson and Mark Freeman have fought very hard to have narrative psychology recognized as a part of more traditional psychology. And they've actually managed to do that within the American Psychological Association and the APA. You know, you have to choose your fights. That's not one I've really dedicated myself to because life is so short. But, you know, Dan McAdams has written about yeah. Okay. Thank you, Jill. Okay, I think that that we should have a break here because Casey's session will start in just a half hour. But what I would say is thank you so very much. Gosh, this chat is absolutely alive. And come tomorrow for the breakout session if you want to talk about more of this stuff. I'm sorry if I filled it with too much of my own talk. And but we will get together again in 28 minutes. Is that right, Corinne?
Yeah, I think so, Molly. Just thanks so much, Molly. This has been a really wonderful way to start. And I think we can all maybe do a kind of clap or something to thank Molly very much for this. It's been really lovely. It's a great way to meet everybody also. So yeah, really looking forward to seeing you all in 27 minutes or something.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much. And we'll just turn off, I guess, is this the same link as Casey's or it's a different one?
Casey has a separate link because we're just recording separately for everything.
Okay. So I'm going to stay on for a minute. I'm going to turn it because I want to read this chat. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you shortly.
Thank you.